Hey guys, Bye for Truth. So I'm going to do this, and I'm going to try to do it as fast as I can. I saw that I did this earlier, and it kept messing up. But anyway, very, kind of depressing, to be honest with you. Even though I have no confidence in man and all that kind of stuff, some stuff you find out, and the world's messed up. You really, it's messed up. I mean, I knew for a long time the world's messed up, but the stuff that people do, guys, and the stuff that people have done, and the things that they are doing, and the stuff they're planning on doing, is just pretty horrible. It's pretty horrible stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and play this for you. It's called Germs, Genocide in America's Indigenous People. And you'll see how it's very relevant for today. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. I don't know. Some people don't want to see, and I understand that. So I'm going to play it, and you'll get a sense of what it's all about.
So in 1976, Alfred Crosby published this article called Virgin Soil Epidemics. And it's often referred to as the virgin soil thesis. It crystallized a lot of thinking scholars had about the impact of infectious diseases on native peoples. Crosby points to native bodies as being, as he says, immunologically almost defenseless, because common diseases of the Eastern Hemisphere were absent from the Americas prior to 1492. Native populations thus did not have the opportunity to acquire immunity to those diseases.
Okay. So that's what he's saying. So the theory, the virgin soil theory, is that, hey, you know what? Because people they have not been exposed to, quote unquote, a certain germ, and then that means they're much more susceptible. And because they haven't built up so-called, quote unquote, immunity, they're saying that their immunity is so weak. That's why they were, large swaths of them were just wiped out. And this is what they want you to believe, right? They want us to believe this kind of thing. And they're saying of those germs that happen, they're trying to say, hey, those are natural things, natural phenomenons that happen. It's not that it was so quote unquote biological warfare. It's just that, this germ came and it was providential that it just happened to wipe out people right at the precursor around the same time as colonialization was taking place. So don't blame us. It was an act of God, is what they're saying, okay? Virgin soil.
Smallpox spread like wildfire, even outpacing the colonizers and igniting outbreaks that went unrecorded. The demise of indigenous peoples thus was a historical accident. The colonizers exercised little agency in this catastrophe, yet were its unwitting beneficiaries.
Okay. So they're saying we weren't agents of it. It wasn't through our agency, meaning we didn't cause it. It wasn't a planned thing where we were planning a pandemic or planning to these germs. It just so happens that it happened as we were there colonizing. Right before we got there, these people happened to get this stuff, as we were interacting with them. And then, just so happens a lot of them died off. And we were just there to clean up the mess. Like, the germ killed most of them. And then we just came in and took care of the rest of them and stole their land and all this kind of other stuff while we were at it. And they're saying this just happened to be the way that the colonizers were able to get the advantage over the native people. And by the way, just coincidentally, this didn't happen just in the North Americas. It happened in South America and Africa and all of Southeast Asia and all these different places. The diseases just happened to be a precursor to the colonizers from Europe coming over and stealing all the people's land. And then they just happened to be there on the ready to kill and clean up because God, according to them, God just happened to be in their favor. Manifest destiny. All right.
To point to disease that can explain the success of Europeans in taking over the Americas. Now, Crosby wasn't alone, and he had tremendous influence, but he was also influenced by the anthropologist Henry Dobbins. He published works on Native American demography beginning in the 1960s and continuing up until the 1990s. Dobbins postulated that a series of undocumented pandemics swept the Americas as early as the 1520s, And based on this postulation, he tried to convince his colleagues that America's Aboriginal population was much larger than previously thought. He made the argument that indigenous population of all the Americas was something like of the magnitude of 112 or 114 million people, when at the time, this is back in the 1960s when he's first doing this, consensus was that the population was about 14 million.
So they're saying, people are trying to say there was 114 million. We think it was only 14 million, a fraction of that. And the reason why we need to make it smaller than that is because we don't want to say that we killed all these people. You got to explain how so many people died. If there was 114 million and then they're saying, well, no, it wasn't that many. It was only 14 million. Why do they say that? Because they don't want to be blamed for going in and killing and trying to genocide all these people. And so they said, well, we'll just bring the number down, and that way we don't have to explain all these deaths. Okay? Make sense?
Some of you probably have read Guns, Germs, and Steel, which won the Pulitzer Prize in history, although Jared Diamond's not a historian. Nonetheless, he incorporated this idea that diseases alone explains European success. Some of you may be familiar with the journalist Charles Mann's popular works on the European conquest. His work, 1491, shows native populations much larger than previously thought, using Dobbin's idea, and then he uses the idea that diseases spread like wildfire, or as he uses a more colorful imagery like ink spreading through tissue paper. He's referring to smallpox supposedly spreading down into the Incan Empire well before the Spanish ever arrived.
Right? So, it was well before we arrived. It wasn't that we sent it. It's just, you guys just happened to die and we showed up and we just cleaned up. It wasn't that it's not germ warfare. It's not that we're secretly using bio warfare on you. It's just where we happen to go and show up. God, how the Bible says God will fight the battles for you? Well, this is kind of like that. God is just basically fighting, driving the enemy out before us. And we just come in and clean up. That's how we, as a small, quote unquote, group, can go out and wipe out all these people. See, we came as friends. We didn't do anything. It's not us. So that's what he's trying to get you to believe.
Now, among scholarly works that claim genocide is an appropriate term to use, David Standard's 1992 book, American Holocaust, The Conquest of the New World, drew the most attention. Published in 1992 in the Columbian Quincentenary by Oxford University Press. Standard did not hold back in his charge of genocide. As you can see by this quote, what happened to the indigenous people is the greatest genocide ever known in history.
Now, wait a minute. How are you going to use that word genocide? Because when I tried to use in my video the word never, a quote unquote, never again, and I was referring to the fact that the history of America, where they were talking about this town in Wilmington, how they had burned down all the so-called independent towns where there were successful black people that they don't teach about in history, because it proved that black people, when they were actually separate and said, at this point, we're not going to so-called rely on the white man back in the 1900s, they built all these successful towns all over the United States that you don't hear about. So one of those towns called Wilmington, in Wilmington, North Carolina, they had successfully won positions in office, had businesses, had newspaper and a free press. And guess what happens? There was a campaign that ran nationally, coordinated via national press all throughout, who told lies on the quote unquote people, vilified them in the eyes of people who had legitimately been voted into office, and then came at gunpoint, told them they must resign their positions, killed people, threw them into the river, burned down the so-called black free press, the black newspaper, because they didn't want people to be able to talk outside of their thing to coordinate. Same thing they do with churches, because they understand churches can be politicized and done. And then they said they tried to bury, quote unquote, the story and hide the history. This is on Vox. You can look this up. And one of the things they said in the charter is they said, never again will we be under Negro rule, will a black man rule over us. Now, the black man that quote unquote ruled over them, out of all the people that were in office, there was only like so many black people were there, but it was pretty fair. And so they use all the so-called tropes. Oh, black men are raping, killing, doing all this different stuff. All a lie. The same thing that was in Birth of a Nation, which President Woodrow Wilson premiered at the White House, which tried to say we won't let Negroes rule, and hence he supports the Ku Klux Klan, but also happened to be a staunch Zionist, right? So he's a racist, but yet he supported the idea of a chosen racial state for the chosen race. And the chosen race just happens to look, let's face it, quote unquote white. Okay? So they're using the term Holocaust. And you got to think about it. That term Holocaust, there's a certain group, they say, no, we have a copyright on the word Holocaust. We will not allow anyone use the word Holocaust. That's why when they said at the beginning, they said 114 million. They say, no, it wasn't 114 million. It's only 14 million, right? Because you have to be like, there's a competition for who's the most hated, right? And you got to think about that. Who's the most hated? There's a competition for who's the most hated. And so they want you to be a respected person. So they're going to diminish the what happened to the Native Americans for the purpose of advancing another quote unquote agenda. So let's go to here. We'll hear that again.
Now, among scholarly works that claim genocide is an appropriate term to use, David Standard's 1992 book, American Holocaust, The Conquest of the New World, drew the most attention. Published in 1992 in the Columbian Quincentenary by Oxford University Press. Standard did not hold back in his charge of genocide. As you can see by this quote, what happened to the indigenous people is the greatest genocide ever known in history. Of course, to make this claim, he has to use the work of Henry Dobbins. The high count, the large numbers of Native peoples.
Okay. So he's saying it's a Holocaust. He's saying it's the worst thing that's happened in human history. 114 million. They said it's only 14 million because they explain all the deaths and all the people missing, right? So they're just going to write that out of history. That never happened. It's kind of like the USS Liberty. So here's what happens, guys. Listen to what happens. It's talking about the tactics that were used during this time against the, quote, Native Americans.
Churchill, the documented episode of the British delivering smallpox-laden materials to Lenapes visiting Fort Pitt in 1763 was the smoking gun that demonstrated widespread efforts of biological warfare. I'll talk about that particular episode later in the talk. But for Churchill, this was just one of many efforts, including the English deliberately infecting Narragansetts in 1633, and the U.S. Army supposedly dispensing smallpox-laden blankets to Mandans in 1837.
Okay. So you have this history of proven, undocumented, that this was biowarfare. So now you're supposed to think, we are supposed to be so stupid as to think, well, no, it's providential. It just so happens, this virgin soil theory, that the disease just came over. And it wasn't that they intentionally gave it to them. It's just that the Europeans had built up an immunity to it. And because they had not even been exposed to it, that's why they were dying off. It wasn't an agenda. And it was just providential to the so-called European colonizers that they would come in, take the land, kill off the people, and finish them off with guns and muskets and all this kind of other stuff, right? All right. So let's keep on going.
Downfall became fodder for those who wanted to keep the term genocide out of the narrative of American history. Leading figures in the American historical profession were far from events from either Churchill's or Standard's claim. Obviously, they're both using the high counts of Henry Dobbins and arguing that genocide happened, but Dobbins' high counts are predicated on the spread of diseases spreading by themselves without human agency.
Right? Diseases spreading by themselves without human agency, meaning, no, there wasn't somebody who came in as a quote-unquote agent and spread it intentionally. This is all supposed to be accidental. That's what they're trying to say. And they're trying to say, no, again, the high count, no, it's not 114 million. That's ridiculous. I mean, 114 million? What do you think we are, monsters? Okay.
Without human agency. The most biting criticism against Churchill and Standard came from a group of scholars that are focused on the Holocaust. To say the least, Standard's expropriation of the word Holocaust and his disrespectful hyperbole did not set well with many. In response to Standard and Churchill, however, opponents to the inclusion of genocide into the vocabulary used to narrate American history diminished the violence waged against Native peoples in order to assert that the Holocaust was a unique event, unrelated in its origins, processes, or outcomes to other episodes of mass human extermination.
So basically what he's saying there's a certain group that said we object to that being used, the word Holocaust. We don't want you to use the word Holocaust when you're talking about the Native Americans. Now, in the Congo, King Leopold killed 11 million Congolese, and that's just what's recorded. And they don't want that to be told either. So now they're diminishing the killings that they've done throughout all the world in their colonialist endeavors, quote unquote, for their ethno-state agenda. And they're saying, no. It's not as many as you think. We had no agency to do with it. And by the way, the numbers are smaller and you can't use the word Holocaust. There was only 14 million. So a lot of them are still surviving. So just based on the numbers, you can't say that we killed a majority and that we tried to wipe them out. Plus, we had nothing to do with it. It was an act of nature, So a certain group doesn't want the word Holocaust to even be used because they got a copyright on Holocaust. Okay? Let's see here.
For Louis, one can only conclude that genocide happened if there was a clear intent to do so. And in the case of American Indians, there was no intent to destroy them in whole or in part.
Right. They said we weren't trying to do it in whole or in part because there was no human agency. This was done by an act of nature, right? This is not some biological weapon. This is an accident. What are you guys talking about? This has happened at some wet market in Wuhan or something like that. It's the animals. Something happened with some animal. Something got out that ended up causing diseases and it naturally started killing people. And, they had no immunity to it. So that's why they died off. And plus it wasn't 114 million. It was only 14 million total. So you can't use the word Holocaust. That word Holocaust belongs to a certain group who are the most hated, quote unquote, supposed in the world. And so we all know that Hitler hated, quote unquote, white people. And the white people somehow now, according to Hitler, have become the chosen race according to this religion. They're claiming it's a religion. And you cannot use the word Holocaust because, there's so much vested in that. You're going to have movie after movie after movie after movie after movie. And that's going to reinforce the notion that these are God's people, because if the world hates you, it hated me first. And we have replaced basically God because the world hates us. The world hates God. Think about it. All right, let's go. So it must be intentional, right? In heart, in part, or in whole.
Stop there. He went to great lengths to dismiss Native suffering. Consider this passage in an essay he penned in the Journal of Genocide Studies. True, the forced relocations of Indian tribes were often accompanied by great hardship and harsh treatment. The removal of the Cherokee from their homelands to territories west of the Mississippi took the lives of thousands and has entered history as the Trail of Tears. However, the largest loss of life occurred well before the creation of the reservations, and some of the most severe epidemics hit the Indians after minimal contact with European traders.
Right. So there was contact, but that was minimal contact. So it hit him after minimal contact. Basically, that minimal contact wasn't to plant and give them a disease. No, they had minimal contact, and wherever we went, disease just happened to break out, but we had nothing to do with it. Hence, it wasn't human agency. Right? So you can't prove it was us, therefore it wasn't us. And plus, we write the history books. And now we're trying to control the history as we speak. And you can't use the word Holocaust because all men are created equal, and we don't want to recognize the death of other people as being equal to the deaths of one group as over another group. Don't you guys get this? Doesn't this make complete sense to you? Doesn't it make sense to you? They don't even want to use the word Holocaust. Doesn't that make... That's very rational, right? Very rational. Okay? Another example.
He does it again with the Sand Creek Massacre, a horrid event in 1864 in which the 3rd Colorado Cavalry attacked a peaceful Southern Cheyenne village, killing between 150 and 270 men, women, and children. Louis mentions this atrocity and then immediately states, "It is well to remember that a far larger number of Indians died from the epidemic diseases unintentionally introduced and spread by the white man from outright violence." Louis uses germs.
So he says, these guys died from the unintentional, and he's calling himself the white man. They died from the unintentional spread. So they admitted it was minimal contact, but he says, but that was an unintentional spread of disease caused by the white man or brought by the white man. Providential. Guys, it's not warfare. Come on. And don't give me this 114 million. It's only 14. Oh, yeah, I know it happened in Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, whatever. It's not a You think this is a tactic or a strategy? I mean, you let the disease wipe them out. You don't have to use all this warfare and money, and then you just come in later and while they're weakened and clean up, quote unquote, cleanse the land, ethnically cleanse them, right? No. Don't be so cynical, guys. Don't be so cynical.
But a few years ago, during the debate on the revision of the AP U.S. History Standards to include a more critical view of Manifest Destiny, conservatives reacted to that and wanted a more celebratory history promoted. And that, of course, generated a lot of discussion. And this is some of the discussion in.
Did you hear that? They wanted a more celebratory history done about Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny, for those of you who don't know, is the same thing as Dominion theology, is God has given us a destiny that's manifested in us ruling the world, ruling wherever we go as God's people. That's the same tactic. That's the same so-called Christopher Columbus, so-called papal bulls. This is the same. Anytime you have people saying God told us that we have a land and it is our destiny to ethnically have claim to a land, that's just Manifest Destiny. You can rename it. You can say, well, I don't call myself a this. I don't say I'm a Christian. It's not the Christian so-called Crusades anymore. This is completely different than what that was. Oh, we're not doing that anymore under that name. We're doing it under another name. And one of the most racist presidents just happened to be an advocate. And some of the two biggest enslaving, colonizing nations just happen to be a supporter. And if disease just happens to come in and kill a bunch of people, then, we got nothing to do with it. That's God coming in. And if minorities happen to die out at a much higher rate than non-so-called minorities, we're willing to sacrifice some people for the greater cause, the Manifest Destiny. But don't be cynical. Don't be cynical.
An Inside Higher Education article, the first person says, what, you can't teach that genocide happened? And then, of course, inevitably someone says, no, it wasn't genocide, it was microbes, it was diseases.
Wasn't genocide. See, as long as it's the disease, and you can't prove that we've given the disease on purpose, you can't prove that it was created in a lab, a level 4 lab. This just happened in a wet market. This just happened in a such and such. And how can I get it into your body, though, if there's a mixed if everyone's living kind of amongst each other? How can I get that disease in your body? Maybe I'll make a cure, but maybe the cure that I make, it won't be so effective. And maybe we'll try to get a handle on this thing, but we won't quite get a handle on it and a more virulent strain will come and it'll just happen to kill off a bunch of people, and we'll just keep on trying and keep on trying, and we'll keep falling behind, and certain people of a certain genetic makeup will die, quote unquote. Genetic makeup will, quote unquote, die, right? Virgin soil. Because wait a minute, how do you teach this theory if you got a bunch of people now with international travel? You can't use the virgin soil theory anymore with international travel, right? Can't use the virgin soil theory with international trial. So how do you get away with this anymore? How do you give out those blankets that you used to give out that were laden? How do you do it now? I don't know.
Mostly gathered and marshaled evidence to make the case. He uses the UN definition, and he indicts California officials from the governor on down who made statements of clear intent that the Indian race ought to be exterminated. The California legislature reimbursed private citizens for hunting natives, and they funded militia campaigns on exterminatory raids. The U.S. government failed to intervene and, in fact, reimbursed California for much of its expenses.
So they got this proof that the government not only said to kill, incentivized people to kill, refunded people to kill, funded militia groups, encouraged people to raid, and reimbursed them gave a bounty for every person you'd kill. Militia groups funded provocateurs, bounty, funded money, incentive. I wonder, do people get incentives for forging the numbers? Maybe if you diagnose each person as having it who doesn't have it, and maybe if you diagnose people as dying from it, even if they didn't die from it, that'll justify and allow you to have the excuse to maybe inoculate, like pass out blankets with the disease in it. And then what you can say is, well, this disease we're trying to solve again. We're trying to help these people with this disease. It's just this virulent strain. And then you just play incompetent, like you're really trying to help. And you can't help it that these certain people of a certain, quote unquote, maybe racial groups happen to be dying off at a much higher rate. It's not manifest destiny. It's not that you did it. You can't say it's genocide. Even if millions upon millions of people die, it's not genocide, people. It's just that it's providential. The earth just decided to attack. And we had nothing to do with it. In fact, we were trying to help. We're trying to help. So don't you come up with some kind of crazy, stupid conspiracy theory. Okay? Because history has shown that there's a virgin soil theory. And we know that certain people don't take care of themselves. And they are going to likely die more faster just because of, one, their genetic makeup. They're more susceptible. And we did the best that we could because we're good and we're kind-hearted like that. Okay? I don't want you to get suspicious.
Madley's work has larger implications beyond what happened in Gold Rush, California. He points, for example, to the fallacy that many make by lumping all Native groups into one category, and then concluding that because some groups did not experience genocide, then the term has no place. So if the Choctaws didn't experience genocide, then you couldn't consider then the Yuki of California to experience genocide. But such lumping and then denial is insulting to Native communities of today, such as the Yuki, whose descendants endured what Madley has documented as the worst of crimes against humanity.
So he's saying you can't say that it was a genocide against Native so-called Americans. If the Cherokees experienced it, but the Choctaw didn't, you can't say it's genocide. But wait a minute. So all Jews must be white because they must not be recognizing if the Ethiopians and the Buba and the Limba, who, based on their own DNA testing, have more of the DNA marker of the Semitic marker gene and claim to be Jew by quote unquote genealogy. If Hitler didn't get them, and there's lots of them, and as you saw in the video that I did, they said there's hundreds of tens of millions of people who have this quote unquote identity. So if they weren't in Hitler's quote unquote camps, and it said that he killed 6 million, but there's 100 and something million Africans who claim to be quote unquote Jew, then you can't claim it's genocide. You see how that argument works? Oh, but wait. They're arguing that here, but they're not applying it there. So they must be telling you that a Jew, even if they have the genetic marker, like the Buba and the Limba tribe, they're saying they don't care about science. Now science doesn't even matter. It seems like it's coming down to something else. It seems like there's another agenda. Right? If you can't classify it as genocide because all the Native Americans didn't experience it, then how then can you classify it genocide if you're going to say that a Jew is based on genealogy when you've proven that there's hundreds of millions of Africans who also are Semitic, who claim to believe the quote unquote that so-called religion, and then you have this Limba tribe who also have the DNA quote unquote marker that quote makes them Jew. How then can you say that that's genocide? If that's your standard, then can you be consistent with your standard? No, you cannot.
Gary Anderson's 2014 book, though, tries to make a different argument. And it stands as a stark reminder of the power of the virgin soil thesis in efforts to keep the term genocide out of narratives of American history. Anderson makes a twofold argument. He doesn't sanitize U.S. colonialism. He believes ethnic cleansing happened repetitively, but yet he says genocide never occurred. To do this, Anderson construes the UN definition of genocide more narrowly and claims that prosecutors must prove that a policy authorizing such an action had been adopted by a government or governmental agency.
See, now we're shifting definitions. See how it works? Okay, all right, yeah, a lot of people did die, but, quote unquote, there was no agency. Okay, maybe there was an agency. Maybe they did give them the disease. Maybe that wasn't the intent to give them diseases. But it wasn't done by a government agency. So it's not genocide if the government doesn't say it. You got to prove. See how the bar of proof just gets higher and higher and higher and higher. You need all these proofs.
We may, of course, take issue with Anderson's narrow reading, and we rightfully should. But for my purpose, here I would like to emphasize what he uses to wiggle out of considering whether genocide occurred even in California. He turns, as many others have, to guess what? The virgin soil thesis. He claims that unintended epidemics had reduced California's native population by 75 to 80% before 1851.
75 to 80%. And he's saying, hey, that's unintentional. We didn't. It's not like we were trying to do it. The government didn't endorse it. 75 to 80%. Okay? Germ warfare, guys. Do you smell ruthlessness here? Cold-hearted psychopaths? Do you smell it?
And then concludes that the action of these germs fundamentally discount a historical judgment that genocide occurred in California. Now, the recent debate between Madley and Anderson
Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next thing. What do they do to try to hide their hand?
dichotomy is either the colonists purposely infected natives with disease, or diseases were introduced unintentionally and spread on their own.
See the choice? Either the colonists purposely introduced disease, or what? It just is introduced and spread on its own accidentally. They brought it, but it was accidentally spread. What was the intent? So now you got to rely on the colonizers to say what their intent was. Do you understand? Do you guys get it? You see how history works now? Okay. Now, a lot of this is predicated on the virgin soil theory. Now, is the virgin soil theory even correct? This whole notion that, well, what really do they mean by virgin soil theory? Let's listen.
What if scholars on both sides of the debate have germs wrong? And if they do, as I will argue, what are the ramifications of their misunderstandings of disease for consideration of including genocide into the moral vocabulary we use to narrate American history? As the germs versus genocide debate raged, important new scholarship has substantially revised how we understand the biological consequences of European conquest and colonization. This body of revisionist scholarship, unfortunately, has not been consulted by either side. Medical historians, archaeologists, and ethnohistorians began questioning the ideas of Crosby and Dobbins soon after they published their works. And today, a rich body of scholarship exists that shows the virgin soil thesis to be deeply problematic.
So, they have proof that this is highly problematic. Wow, that's interesting. Could someone tell the government and the people hear that? What's problematic about it? Please tell us.
Now, the first problem with the virgin soil thesis, has been shown lately, is that there's a lack of rigor considering immunity. Now, Crosby meant that Native peoples lacked acquired immunity, but many would read into his work the notions that Native peoples lacked genetic immunity, and there is a big difference between the two. The assumption, by reading genetic immunity, the assumption is that the processes of natural selection took place in Europe, in which Europeans had many generations of experience with diseases like smallpox, and somehow they developed genetic traits that allowed them to survive smallpox better than populations that had never had experience before that. The problem with that is that smallpox, like many of these common crowd diseases, have not been around in human history long enough for natural selection to do that process.
Yeah, because think about it. If it knocked out, what did he say, 70 to 80% of the quote unquote these groups, then if that's the case, when it first got introduced to Europeans, it should have knocked out 70 to 80% of Europeans. But wait, unless you're trying to argue that you have superior genes and that they have weaker genes, and that their immunity system isn't the same, meaning not all men are the same. You know, forget that everybody came from Adam and Eve. We're going to teach that they just can't handle it because they have inferior genes and they have an inferior immunity system, right? But the problem is, as this guy is pointing out so astutely, that you can't argue that because it hadn't been around long enough for you to make that claim. And you're also assuming that there's something inherently wrong with their quote unquote immunity system, that somehow they're distinctive. And you're talking about an evolutionary quote unquote process. You know, that Darwinist favored races thing.
Smallpox is a relatively new history in human evolution. It's only been around since about 6,000 years ago, and there's no scientific evidence that there's any kind of genetic immunity against smallpox. But nonetheless, you'll see this, and you'll see this today, this reference to the supposed genetic immunity.
Okay. Now let's keep going on. Let's go here.
Europeans hardly had any experience with. Yellow fever, which is an African disease, for example.
So he's talking about there's other diseases that Europeans hardly had any exposure to. So if that's the case, then how come that theory doesn't work? Oh, they had more exposure, therefore they developed this immunity, by acquired immunity, et cetera, et cetera. But he's like, well, that doesn't work because there's other diseases that were supposedly more new, yellow fever, et cetera, right?
Cholera, which would come over in the 19th century, was a South Asian disease. Those would be as new to Europeans as they were to indigenous.
So let's notice all the places. North America, Southeast Asia, Africa. Interesting. Very, very interesting. All these things happening around the great colonization time. Isn't that really weird? Isn't it interesting, guys? Isn't it very interesting? Yeah.
Indigenous peoples.
So what's going on? What is this? What are they truly trying to say with their theory?
Indigenous immune systems were no less sophisticated than European immune systems. So to say that Native peoples had no immunity is very misleading. They certainly had immune systems. What they lacked was acquired immunity to a certain number of diseases such as smallpox. Another problem with the virgin soil thesis is this hyperinflated, I need to come up with a shorter kind of bullet point there, couldn't do it. But it's this kind of hyperbole that surrounds the impact of diseases. And Henry Dobbins' scholarship is full of this, that somehow smallpox, once deposited in one place, spread like wildfire and hit all of the Americas, which ignores geography, settlement patterns, trade and intercourse patterns, things that diseases would have to navigate through to reach distant places. And there's simply a lack of evidence. This 1518 to 1526 smallpox epidemic that supposedly swept from Chile to Canada, you either believe it or you don't. There's no evidence for it. A third problem is that this scholarship, this virgin soil thesis scholarship, renders indigenous peoples only as passive victims. Their bodies, virgin bodies, succumb to disease. It assumes indigenous leaders and healers were fatalistic and took no effort to protect their people.
Well, how could they take any efforts to protect their people? Because remember what the attitude was. Remember the colonists came over, they were calling everybody savages and heathens, right? That's their whole thing. They were the biblical Christians, manifest destiny, right? God had given them this right, birthright to rule the world. So, I mean, what do you think? You think they had medicine, civilizations? What? Oh my goodness! Next thing you know, you'll be talking about Egypt is in Africa, or some crazy thing like that, or Mozambique, or Songhai Empire, and all the great Aztec temples and stuff. You'll be talking about India and all these places having all these great structures, megalithic structures, and saying they actually built it. You know, that's crazy. It's talking crazy talk now. Crazy talk. So that's the problem with that. Now we're going to go down to here. What else did they do?
Retarded fertility, decreased reproduction rates, and prevented them from recovering. Those factors indeed could be non-disease related: warfare, slavery, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. Processes that depressed female fertility and took away community members of reproductive age.
Okay. So they attacked them first with all this stuff. Then on top of that, they came in later. Now that we killed off most of the people, we've softened you up. Now we can conquer you with not using that many people. And plus we have our technology. But now that we've killed most of you off, now we're going to come in and finish you off. We're going to sterilize the women, including take some for ourselves and do all kinds of stuff. Take away the people who are productive age, all kinds of, just do those things. So here you have this history, and these guys are trying to get away from their own history. There's certain people who have an agenda to try to hide the history, hide the reality. Okay, I'm going to go on here. Remember, their whole thing was like, Now the criteria is you must make sure, because it can't be a genocide, because the genocide is reserved for a certain group, and you gotta not just prove intent, agency. You also have to prove that we meant to do it intentionally, and that the government warranted it, advocated it, endorsed it. Well, this guy goes on and does more research.
In his December 1833 address to Congress, the president in fact remarked, "The experiment, which has been recently made, has so far proved successful." He stated this as a matter of fact and without the slightest suggestion of what he fully knew. Thousands of Choctaws were then dying because of this experiment. Despite Jackson's rhetorical cover-up, the Choctaws' experience, widely reported in the press and in government correspondence, confirmed the warnings that opponents of the Indian Removal Act had made. Yet the Jackson administration carried on with this policy without any regard to the health of the Indians and continued to turn a blind eye to their death and suffering. Cholera, in other words, did not act according to a pattern that the virgin soil thesis postulated. It infected a group suffering from the policies that a consensus of historians now describe as ethnic cleansing.
So the guy wrote about it. It's very obvious they knew about it. It was a policy. They called it the experiment. They were doing the germ warfare purposefully and intended to do it with agency. And they're just trying to, some historians are just trying to cover it up. Why can't we have a more celebratory view of Manifest Destiny? I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to start telling people that the way that we conquer and cleanse the land of unwanted undesirables is by intentionally spreading diseases? If you start doing that, then what are people going to think about us? I mean, if people start thinking that's a strategy that we've done in the past, somebody might try to start making the connections and making relevance to how it could happen now. They may not trust us when we say there's a quote-unquote global pandemic, and they may not trust that we will inject them with the solution. We don't know what's in that solution. So we don't want people to be distrustful of the government and of the medical so-called system. Right? We would never use the medical system. We would never covertly have a covert war against the American citizens. That would be treasonous. We don't want people to think that. Do you know how cold-hearted that would be? Because what would happen is some white people may become susceptible to this thing and they would die and they'd be thinking, you did this to me and I'm white. And then we'd have no cohesion. We got to keep the racial stratification going. That's these white people who are on the outside, the outsider white people, they're our buffer zone. And so if they realize that we're shamming them, that we're using them too, and that we're willing to sacrifice some of them for the bigger agenda, that's not good. This thing might fall apart. So we got to be very good about how we do this. No, we're relying, these people, we believe the natives are stupid. And so they'll never put this together. These guys will never solve this thing. We're really smart. We're high IQ. They'll never figure it out. Survival of the fittest. This is a what do you call it? This is a racial hygiene. Racial hygiene. We want those lands, we want those resources, we want those goods. We must stay on top at all costs. And if we got to kill some people who look like us to do it, so be it. So be it. But there's so few of us. We own so much, there's so few of us, so many of them. So how do we do that? Plus they got guns. How do we do it? We let them move off the plantation, so we can't necessarily just go in We're trying to tell everybody that we're going around spreading democracy and all this kind of stuff around the world. How do we do it now? If we've been preaching that we're just spreading liberty all over the place, how do we do it now? How do we? And if they see through this, they'll see that there's really no such thing as a quote unquote. They may not salute the flag anymore. Right? They might not want to join the white power movement anymore. The one that's got all the government agents in it, all the, the militia groups. So that's why we got to get these robots and these military things in place. We got to get drones, facial recognition, friend or foe. We got to get the advanced technology that will kill whoever we say to kill. Because, these humans, even though we dupe them, they're not as reliable as we'd want them to be. We don't want them to get a conscience. They may realize they're being duped. And, the robot, we can program it to do what it wants to do. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't flinch. It kills whoever we tell it to kill. And with facial recognition, we can tell it can't kill us. We foreshadowed all this stuff in all the movies, but these idiots, they weren't even smart enough to realize we were telling them what was going to happen. We were conditioning them. We were social programming them. And now they're too stupid to even realize. We let them eat cake. We got them distracted. They were distracted. Right? They didn't care about what was going on in Africa when we were doing it to the Africans. They didn't care. They weren't suspicious at all. They didn't care about the Tuskegee experiments. They didn't care. So now we made this lie up called a chosen race. And wait a minute. Who was involved in that killing? Did Africa do that? No. Oh, that's right. Africa didn't do that. Did the Native American? No, they didn't do that either. Who killed? So wait a minute. Hitler killed what kind of people to establish a nation for a people? What color are they again? Interesting. Woodrow Wilson, Birth of a Nation. It's an interesting movie. It's a very interesting movie. You think people would kill people who look like themselves for a bigger agenda? I don't know anything about that USS Liberty thing. Do you know about that?
It's hard not to agree that ethnic cleansing occurred when Andrew Jackson himself says, and this is not the only example, that the purpose of it is to expel the Indians to make room for the whites. Andrew Jackson himself says, and this is not the only example, that the purpose of it is to expel the Indians to make room for the whites. Andrew Jackson himself says, and this is not the only example, that the purpose of it is to expel the Indians to make room for the whites.
Didn't Bill Gates say, in his open letter, how the African population is growing exponentially, that half the world's population, and that they're so young? Europe and America is living off the largesse of their conquest. And people decide they don't want to have that many kids. Two kids. Who needs more than two? In Africa, they have, 8, 9, all these kids. And so now it's Africa's fault. Yeah, it's Africa's fault. So Bill Gates is complaining about overpopulation, and he's going over and he's deciding he's going to give free vaccinations. And amazingly, all kinds of diseases are popping up. Sterilization agents are being found in it. Infant mortality is up. What does the Bible say about there being anything new under the sun? Nothing new, right? But we don't want to engage in any quote unquote conspiracy theory. Or we don't want to engage in any history. Remember, all you guys who are just so fascinated, infatuated, and tied into race. You want to know how we quote unquote got here, guys? We can all just look in the mirror. Look in the mirror. We stood by, right? We stood by. And so now, chickens, as Malcolm X would have told us, chickens coming home to roost. You think, oh, they did it to them, they wouldn't do it to us. Hell, here's a secret. Given that there's no such thing as a Jewish quote unquote race, so you don't blame the Jews, guys. It's not the Jews. People call themselves something that they're not, but don't blame the Jews, because a true Jew is a person who's born again by the Spirit, a child of God. Nobody's a Jew according to the flesh. Not the Limba, not the Buba, not the Ashkenazi. No, what happened was some people killed some other people under the plan of faking Bible prophecy so that they can establish themselves and their select group of families as being in power. And if they did it to them, they have no problem doing it to you. Men, women, and children. So, if I was you, I'd believe the gospel. If I was you, today if you hear his voice, harden not your heart. God is a spirit, and those that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. There's one God. His name is Jesus. He's a spirit. And one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. The man Christ Jesus said, a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as you see here that I have. Because God's eternal, and the things which are not seen are eternal, God has to come in the likeness of sinful flesh. Hence, it's God that speaketh in me. The words that I'm giving you, these aren't the words of my flesh. This isn't the words of my carnal mind. I'm telling you the gospel. The gospel, the good news, the glad tidings. And I'm telling you that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. All. And you're not going to be justified by the law, because all the atrocities that you hear about these people doing, guess what? The labor from our flesh and our tax dollars helped to fund those genocidal wars. How much of our tax dollars go over to the so-called Middle East, guys? How much of our tax dollars go over to, quote unquote, Africa under the guise of charity, as we've stolen their lands? So we all have blood on our hands. And I'm telling you that you got to be saved by grace through faith. It's a free gift. Free. Let whosoever come. Whosoever. And all you're believing is you're just believing that God is merciful. He's good. righteous, just. And you're not trying to glory in your flesh, and you're not trying to justify yourself before God. You're not saying, you know what, I thank God I'm not like other men. I'm not as bad as those quote unquote colonizers. No, you're not saying that. You know you're a sinner, and you know you need to be saved by grace through faith, and that you must be born again by incorruptible seed, by the word of God that liveth and abideth forever. And so what you're doing by believing the gospel is you're just denying yourself. You're saying, in my flesh dwells no good thing. You're saying there's none righteous, no, not one. Only God is righteous. So I need to be born again, a new creature, be found in him, having not mine own righteousness. And God's saying, if you believe on me, a spirit, and not on yourself, and put no confidence in men, he says, I give you eternal life freely. Freely. You can't earn eternal life. Okay? So I hope that you believe it, because the enemy's out there, guys. And don't be your own worst enemy. Don't be your own worst enemy. Don't oppose yourself. Don't be a stiff-necked and uncircumcised of heart. Because if you perish, it's because you didn't believe. And Jesus says, my sheep, I know them. They never perish. I give unto them eternal life, and none shall snatch them from my hand. Okay? We're not relying on our flesh. We know our flesh is going to stay here. All flesh will perish and go back to the dust. We know that. All right. Praise my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen.